It started with the idea of clearing my head for a few days. Life had been weighing me down lately. Work stress, bills piling up, the usual kind of stuff that keeps you awake at night. I wasn't in the mood for company or small talk, so I decided to get out of the city and spend a weekend in the deep woods. There's something about being out there alone that always felt refreshing to me. I figured a few days of isolation would do the trick. The woods I picked were off the beaten path. Not your usual state park with neatly marked trails and scenic overlooks. I wanted the real thing, raw and untouched. I found a section of national forest that seemed remote enough and drove out early on a Friday morning. It was about a 3-hour drive from home. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, it was almost noon. I parked my truck on an old logging road that didn't look like it had been used in years. I had a good pack with me. Plenty of water, some basic food supplies, a tent, sleeping bag, knife, and a map of the area. My phone had no service out there, but I wasn't worried. I wasn't planning to rely on it anyway. The weather was decent, cool but not cold, with a little breeze that carried the smell of pine and damp earth. Perfect hiking weather. I set out into the woods with no specific destination in mind, just following the terrain and letting the trees and hills guide me. For the first few hours, everything felt right, peaceful even. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. I found a spot by a small creek and set up camp around mid-afternoon. It was a nice, flat area with a good clearing for my tent. I spent some time gathering firewood, building a small fire, and boiling some water for my dinner. As the sun started to dip below the treetops, the woods grew darker fast. Out there, the night settles in thick and heavy. I wasn't scared, though. I camped alone plenty of times before, and I liked the solitude. There's something calming about sitting by a fire in the middle of nowhere, just listening to the sounds of the forest. I stayed up for a while, staring into the flames until my eyes got heavy, then crawled into my tent and drifted off to sleep. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of my sleep. The fire had died down to just a few glowing embers, and the woods around me were pitch black. I lay there for a minute, listening. There was something moving outside the tent. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, deliberate, a crunch of leaves, then a pause, then another crunch. It sounded like footsteps. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but something about it didn't feel right. The steps had been too steady, too human-like. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The light cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything at first, just trees and shadows. I scanned the area around my camp, my breath visible in the cold air. Nothing. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination when I caught a glimpse of something. Just a flash of movement in the trees about 20 yards away. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but it was there. I froze, staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But my gut was telling me otherwise. Something or someone was out there. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with my knife in hand, listening to the woods. The footsteps didn't come back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my skin crawl. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. The sunlight made everything seem less threatening, and I started to convince myself that I had overreacted. Maybe it had been an animal after all. I packed up camp and decided to keep moving deeper into the woods. I wasn't ready to turn back yet. I told myself that a little paranoia was normal when you're alone in the middle of nowhere. But the feeling didn't go away. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. The woods felt different now, less peaceful, more oppressive. The trees seemed to press in closer, and the air felt heavier. Around midday, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. It was a campsite, or at least it had been at some point. The remains of a tent were scattered across the ground, torn and weathered from exposure. There was an old fire ring filled with ash and charred wood, but it looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. And then I saw the backpack. It was sitting against a tree, half covered in leaves and dirt. It looked like it had been there for months, maybe longer. I walked over and unzipped it, my hands trembling. Inside, I found some clothes, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a water bottle. There was also a wallet. The ID inside belonged to a man named Eric something. I can't remember the last name now, but the date on the driver's license sent a chill down my spine. It had expired 2 years ago. I stood there for a long time, staring at the abandoned campsite, trying to piece together what might have happened. Had this guy gotten lost? Hurt? Had someone or something found him out here? I suddenly felt very exposed, standing there in the middle of the woods with nothing but trees and silence around me. I stuffed the wallet back into the backpack and hurried away, my mind racing. I knew I should probably head back to my truck, but a stubborn part of me didn't want to admit that I was scared. I decided to push on for a few more hours, thinking I'd circle back around and make it to the truck by nightfall. That was a mistake. The farther I went, the more lost I felt. The landscape started to blur together. Every hill and tree looked the same, and the map I had wasn't much help. By late afternoon, I realized I had no idea where I was. Panic started to set in. I tried retracing my steps, but it only made things worse. The woods seemed to twist and shift around me, leading me in circles. My heart was racing now, and my breathing grew shallow. Then I heard the footsteps again. They were behind me, distant at first, but growing closer. I broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise I was making. My only thought was to get away. The footsteps followed. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, the woods were silent again. I stood there, listening, every muscle in my body tense. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I started walking again, slower this time, trying to stay calm. The sun was starting to set, and I knew I needed to find shelter before night fell. That's when I found the cabin. It was tucked into a hollow at the base of a hill, barely visible through the trees. It looked old, the wood weathered and gray, but it was still standing. I approached cautiously, my knife in hand, half expecting someone or something to be inside. The door was ajar, creaking on rusty hinges as I pushed it open. The inside was dark and smelled of mildew and rot. There was a single room with a broken-down cot, a table, and a wood stove. I shut the door behind me and bolted it with a heavy wooden beam. It wasn't much, but it felt safer than being out in the open. I spent the night in that cabin, sitting by the door with my knife and flashlight, jumping at every sound. The footsteps didn't come back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside, waiting. When morning finally came, I didn't waste any time. I left the cabin and started moving, determined to find my way back to the truck. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to eat. I just kept walking, driven by pure adrenaline. It took me most of the day, but I finally found the old logging road. When I saw my truck, I almost cried with relief. I didn't look back as I drove away, and I haven't been back since. I still think about that weekend sometimes, about the footsteps, the abandoned campsite, the cabin. I'll never know what really happened out there, and maybe that's for the best. All I know is that something was out there with me, something I couldn't explain. And whatever it was still out there when I left. I had always loved the woods, the quiet and the isolation that came with them. The endless trees, the soft bed of leaves underfoot, and the smell of pine and earth is where I felt most at peace. So when I decided to take a solo weekend trip deep into the forest, it felt like just another adventure. Nothing new, nothing dangerous, just me, the trees, and my thoughts. I packed my old canvas backpack with the essentials: water, a few protein bars, a first aid kit, and my favorite knife, the same one my dad gave me years ago. I threw in a map and a compass, though I hardly ever used them anymore. I knew these woods better than most people know their own neighborhoods, or at least I thought I did. The first day was perfect. The sky was a pale blue without a single cloud, and the air had that crisp autumn bite. I parked my truck at the edge of the trailhead, locked it up, and set off. My plan was simple: hike about 10 miles into the woods, find a good spot to set up camp, and spend the weekend disconnected from everything. No phone, no people, just nature. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant sound of a stream trickling somewhere off to my left. By early afternoon, I found a small clearing tucked between two ridges. It was perfect. The ground was relatively flat, and there were enough trees around to break the wind if it picked up later. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. As the sun started to dip behind the trees, I sat by the fire, eating a granola bar and sipping water from my canteen. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I told myself that's why I came out here, to get away from the constant noise of the world. That night, I slept hard, the kind of sleep you only get when you're far from everything and everyone. I woke up once, maybe around 2 a.m., to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Probably a deer or a raccoon, I thought. I listened for a few minutes, my hand resting on the handle of my knife, just in case. But whatever, it was moved off, and soon I was asleep again. The next morning, I felt refreshed and ready to explore. I decided to leave my tent and most of my gear behind and do a bit of wandering. I'd always been curious about what lay beyond the ridges. Maybe I'd find an old logging road or a hidden stream. The possibilities were endless. I grabbed my knife, compass, and canteen and headed out. I spent most of the morning hiking further into the woods, climbing over fallen logs and picking my way through thick underbrush. Around midday, I found a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the surrounding forest. I sat there for a while, enjoying the view and the feeling of being completely alone. It was one of those moments that make you feel small in the best way, like the world is vast and you're just a tiny part of it. But as I sat there, something caught my eye, a flash of movement down in the trees. I squinted, trying to make it out. It looked like a person. They were moving quickly, weaving between the trees. My first thought was that it was another hiker, but something about the way they moved felt off. They were hunched over, almost like they were crawling, and their movements were jerky and uneven. I stood up, watching them. They disappeared behind a cluster of trees, and for a moment, everything was still again. I told myself it was probably just my eyes playing tricks on me, a trick of the light or a deer moving awkwardly. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to head back to my camp. The woods felt different now, heavier somehow. The light seemed dimmer, even though the sun was still high in the sky. Every snap of a twig made me flinch, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I liked. When I finally made it back to my camp, I felt a wave of relief. The familiar sight of my tent and fire pit was comforting. But that relief didn't last long. My tent flap was open, and the contents of my backpack were scattered on the ground. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into it, but as I got closer, I realized that wasn't the case. The food was untouched. My canteen was still full, but my map was gone along with my compass. I stood there for a long moment trying to make sense of it. An animal wouldn't have taken those things. And even if another person had stumbled across my camp, why would they take a map and compass but leave everything else? A cold knot of fear settled in my stomach. I quickly gathered what was left of my gear and stuffed it into my pack. I needed to get out of there. I could find my way back without the map and compass. I knew the general direction of the trailhead. All I had to do was keep heading west. I set off at a brisk pace, my eyes scanning the trees around me. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just spooking myself. But deep down, I knew better. About an hour into my hike back, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a tree, its bark stripped away in long, deep gouges. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and raw. They were too high up to be from a deer, and too wide to be from a bear. I felt a surge of panic and started moving faster. My legs burned, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of those woods. The sun was starting to set when I finally stumbled onto the trail. Relief washed over me. I was almost out. Just a few more miles, and I'd be back at my truck. But then I heard it. Footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped. I turned around, my heart pounding. There was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I forced myself to keep moving, walking as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. The footsteps started again, matching my pace. I could hear them, just out of sight, always staying the same distance behind me. I stopped again and they stopped too. No, I whispered to myself. You're just imagining it. But I wasn't. I broke into a run. My boots pounded against the trail, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps behind me quickened, keeping pace. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting to my truck. If I could just make it to my truck, I'd be safe. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, I saw the glint of metal through the trees. My truck. I sprinted the last few yards and practically threw myself against the door. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the lock. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and locked it. For a few moments, I just sat there, trying to catch my breath. My whole body was trembling, and sweat dripped down my face. I reached for the ignition, my fingers brushing against the key, when something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the fading light. They didn't move. They just stood there watching me. I didn't wait to see what they would do. I turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back on the main road, surrounded by streetlights and the comforting hum of civilization. I never went back to those woods. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a series of strange events that happened to line up in the worst possible way. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that figure standing at the edge of the trees watching me, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to wander too far into the woods. All I know is that I'll never be that person again. I didn't plan to stay out so late. The sun was already hanging low when I tightened my backpack straps and started the hike. It was supposed to be simple: walk the marked trail, enjoy the solitude for a few hours, then head back before dark. But things never go as planned, do they? The woods were thick, far thicker than I remembered. I had been out here a few times before, nothing serious, just short hikes to clear my mind. Something about being in the woods always calmed me down, but today felt different. The trees pressed in closer, and the silence hung heavier. There was a chill in the air, too sharp for late summer. I noticed it right away, but I told myself it was nothing. The trail started easy, the dirt path clear beneath my feet. A steady rhythm of crunching leaves and snapping twigs followed me as I walked. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, the kind of scent that sticks to your clothes for hours after you leave. I liked that smell. It made me feel connected to the place. But even with the familiar scent, something felt off. I ignored it at first, kept walking. I was moving fast, my boots kicking up dirt as I followed the curve of the trail. The trees above stretched so high they almost blocked out the sky. Long branches twisted and tangled together, leaving only slivers of fading sunlight to slip through. I glanced at my watch. 6:30 p.m., plenty of time to make it back. Or so I thought. The first sign that something was wrong was the lack of noise.
No birds.
No wind, not even the hum of insects. The only sound was my breathing, steady but a little too loud in the silence. I paused, listening, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. Nothing did. I kept walking a little faster this time. About half a mile later, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. They were small but easy to spot if you looked for them. Bright orange squares nailed to trees every 100 yards or so. I glanced around. Nothing. I stopped again, turning in a slow circle. The trees all looked the same, tall, dark, and endless. I tried to convince myself I had just missed a marker. It was easy to do if you weren't paying attention. Still, a knot tightened in my stomach. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Not even one bar. Great. I considered turning back, retracing my steps until I found the last marker. It seemed like the smartest option, but something about the idea made me hesitate. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like turning back wasn't right. So I kept going. The light faded faster than I expected. The shadows grew long, stretching across the trail like black fingers. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the dimming light. The woods seemed different in the artificial glow, more menacing, less familiar. The trail grew narrow, the dirt path swallowed by undergrowth and fallen leaves. My boots crunched louder now, the sound echoing in the silence. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but it came quicker with every step. Then I saw it, a break in the trees ahead. Relief washed over me. I hurried toward it, expecting to find an open clearing or a sign of the trail. What I found instead stopped me cold. A river. I hadn't crossed a river on the way in. The water was dark, almost black in the fading light. It rushed by, fast and cold, the sound of it filling the silence. I stood on the edge, staring at it, trying to make sense of how I got here. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I turned around, my flashlight sweeping across the trees. Nothing looked familiar. Every direction seemed the same, endless woods stretching into the dark. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I wasn't lost. I just needed to think. I decided to follow the river downstream. Rivers usually led to something, a road, a town, anything. It was a better option than wandering aimlessly through the trees. The ground was uneven, the thick undergrowth making every step a struggle. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a second before coming back stronger. I tightened my grip on it, my knuckles white. Time slipped away as I walked. Minutes stretched into hours. The trees closed in tighter, their branches clawing at my jacket. The river roared beside me, its sound a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. Then I saw it, a cabin. It sat back from the river, half hidden by the trees. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. It looked old, abandoned, but it was shelter, and right now that was enough. I made my way toward it, my footsteps crunching loudly on the dead leaves. The cabin loomed larger as I got closer, its weathered wood blackened with age. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and cold. My flashlight swept across the room, illuminating a small table, a broken chair, and a stone fireplace. Cobwebs hung thick in the corners, and the air smelled like damp wood and rot. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I moved toward the fireplace, shining my light inside. Ashes, cold and gray, sat in a pile at the bottom. I looked around for wood but found nothing usable. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I could stay here until morning, then head back toward the river. With daylight, it would be easier to find my way out. The cabin groaned around me, the old wood settling in the cold night air. I told myself it was just the wind. The hours crawled by. My flashlight flickered again, its beam growing weaker. I tapped it against my knee, hoping it would hold out a little longer. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, the flashlight was off, and the cabin was pitch black. My heart jumped into my throat. I fumbled with the flashlight, pressing the button over and over. Nothing. My eyes adjusted slowly, shapes emerging from the darkness. The table, the chair, the fireplace. Then I heard it, a soft crunch outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I strained to listen, every muscle in my body tensed. Another crunch, closer this time. Footsteps. I stayed perfectly still, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Silence. I waited, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. The pale moonlight spilled inside, casting a long shadow across the floor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door closed again, the soft thud echoing in the silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed, then hours. Eventually, the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls. I stood, my legs stiff and trembling. I opened the door slowly, stepping outside into the cold morning air. The forest was quiet again, the river a soft murmur in the distance. I didn't wait. I followed the river until I found a road, my legs moving on autopilot. A car passed not long after, the driver slowing as he saw me. He rolled down his window, his eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm fine." But I wasn't. I never went back to those woods. I still think about that cabin sometimes, about the footsteps, about the door that opened and closed on its own. Some things are better left behind, and some places, once they have you, never really let you go. I've spent a lot of time in the woods over the years. It's not the kind of thing that makes me special. Lots of people hike or camp, but for me it was more of a routine. I grew up near these woods, endless miles of thick forest stretching out past the horizon like an ocean of trees. My dad took me hunting out here when I was 12, told me the forest was like a second home. I believed him too right up until last fall. That's when everything changed. It started like any other trip. I'd been planning a solo hike through the southern section of the National Forest off-trail, away from the busy campgrounds and marked paths. That's how I liked it. Quiet, isolated, peaceful. I wasn't looking for any adventure, just a few days to clear my head. I packed light, a tent, some basic survival gear, a day's worth of food, and a water filter. I knew how to live off the land if I had to, how to catch trout in the streams, how to spot edible plants. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before. The first day was uneventful. I parked my truck at the edge of a fire road, slung my pack over my shoulders, and headed into the woods. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that makes you breathe a little deeper. The sky was clear, the sun warm on my back. I made good time, covering 10 miles before setting up camp near a stream. The second day was when things started to feel off. It was little things at first, hardly enough to notice. The woods felt quieter than usual. No birdsong, no rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. Just the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves and the distant sound of running water. I told myself it was nothing. Animals move around. Sometimes a patch of forest just feels quiet. But then I found the clearing. It was mid-afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, when I stumbled across it. A wide, open space in the middle of the forest. The grass was dead, flattened in strange patterns like something large had been moving through it. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, scanning the ground. At first, I thought it might have been a bear, but the more I looked, the less sense it made. The flattened grass wasn't random. It formed a rough circle, maybe 30 feet across. I don't know why, but standing there made my skin crawl. Something about that clearing felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just wrong. I stood there for a while, listening, but all I could hear was the wind in the trees. I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I'd been alone for almost 2 days by that point. It's easy to get jumpy when there's no one around to ground you. So I kept walking. By the time the sun started to set, I was deep in the woods. I found a spot to set up camp on a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. I cooked a quick meal on my camp stove, then sat by the fire, watching the shadows stretch out across the trees. That's when I saw the light. At first, I thought it was a star, just a pinprick of light in the distance. But it was too low, hovering just above the treetops. It flickered, bobbing gently, almost like someone was carrying a lantern through the woods. My first thought was that it was another hiker. Maybe they'd gotten lost and were trying to find their way back to the trail. I called out, but my voice sounded small and thin in the dark. The light didn't move. I stood there, staring at it for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a plane far off in the distance, or a reflection from the setting sun. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I didn't sleep much that night. Day 3 the next morning. I packed up camp and started hiking again. I told myself I'd head back to the truck. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but I'd had enough. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt off. The trail back should have taken me half a day, but somehow, I kept getting turned around. The sun was high overhead, but no matter which direction I walked, I couldn't seem to find the fire road. I tried to stay calm, but after a couple of hours, panic started to set in. I knew these woods. I'd spent most of my life wandering through them. There was no reason I should be lost. And yet I stopped to check my map and compass, but they didn't make any sense. The compass needle spun lazily, refusing to settle on a direction. The map felt like a cruel joke, a collection of meaningless lines and symbols. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling in the underbrush just behind me. I spun around, expecting to see a deer or a raccoon, but there was nothing there. Then I heard it again, closer this time. My heart was hammering in my chest. I tightened my grip on the hiking pole in my hand, scanning the trees. Something was out there, moving just out of sight. I could feel it watching me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. A minute, an hour. Eventually, the sound faded, and the woods fell silent again. I turned back the way I'd come, moving as quickly as I could without running. My pack felt heavier with every step, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached a small creek. I dropped to my knees, splashing water on my face, trying to calm down. That's when I saw the footprints. They were pressed into the soft mud along the edge of the creek. Big human footprints, too big to be mine. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it. They were fresh, so fresh that water was still pooling in them. Someone had been standing there, watching me. I don't remember much after that. Just running. Running until my legs gave out, until my lungs felt like they were on fire. Hashtag the last night I found a spot to camp just before sunset. A rocky outcrop that gave me a clear view of the surrounding woods. I built a fire, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The shadows seemed to press in around me, flickering and shifting at the edge of the firelight. I sat with my back to the rocks, clutching my knife, listening to the woods. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I didn't sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the camp. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat there, knife in hand, staring into the darkness. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of light. I could feel eyes on me, feel the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps moved away. I stayed awake until dawn, my body tense, every muscle aching. Hashtag the escape. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up and started moving. My only thought was to get out of the woods, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. I don't know how long I hiked, hours maybe, but eventually I stumbled onto the fire road. The sight of that dusty track nearly brought me to tears. I followed it back to my truck, my legs shaking with every step. When I finally reached it, I collapsed against the side, gasping for breath. I didn't look back, didn't stop to rest. Just threw my pack in the back, started the engine, and drove. Even now, I can't explain what happened out there. I've told myself 100 different stories, tried to convince myself it was just some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But deep down, I know that's not true. Something was out there in those woods, and it was hunting me. The woods stretched endlessly before me, a thick and tangled mess of trees and undergrowth that seemed to swallow the light. I tightened the straps on my backpack and adjusted my footing on the narrow trail. I wasn't lost, not yet, but I was starting to feel uneasy. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, in and out, 5 hours tops, the kind of thing I'd done dozens of times before, but something about today felt different. I checked my watch. 3:47 p.m., plenty of daylight left, but the sun hung low enough to cast long shadows through the trees. My trail map was folded neatly in my cargo pocket, though I hadn't needed it for the first few miles. This was familiar territory. I knew the turns and bends, the subtle dips in the land where the trail veered close to the river before climbing up into the hills again. But somewhere along the way, I must have taken a wrong turn. I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while, too long actually, and the more I walked, the less familiar everything looked. It wasn't panic, not yet, but a low hum of anxiety started buzzing in the back of my head. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but of course, there was no service. Out here, deep in the woods, the signal was non-existent. I'd expected that. I'd even welcomed it initially. A break from the constant noise of life. Just me and nature. Now it felt like nature had grown teeth. I took a deep breath and tried to focus. Think logically. I had a compass, a knife, enough water to last a day, and a few protein bars. I could handle this. Worst case scenario, I'd backtrack until I found the last trail marker and correct my course. No big deal. I turned around and started retracing my steps, my boots crunching softly on the leaf-strewn path. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches creaking and swaying above me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, that primal part of the brain that starts firing off alarms when things don't feel right. 20 minutes passed, 30. I still hadn't found the trail marker. The more I walked, the less familiar everything looked. The hum of anxiety grew louder. I paused and scanned the area around me. The undergrowth was thicker here. The trees pressed in closer, their trunks gnarled and dark. My eyes caught movement to the right. I froze. It was just a branch swaying in the breeze. I shook my head and kept walking, forcing myself to stay calm. This was how people got lost for real. Panicking, rushing, making bad decisions. I wasn't going to be one of those people. I just needed to stay focused. But it wasn't getting any easier. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and loose rocks that made every step a careful calculation. My legs were starting to ache. Sweat trickled down my back despite the cool air. The shadows grew longer, deeper. The light was fading faster than I'd expected. I checked my watch again. 4:28 p.m. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't going to find my way out before dark. I stopped and took a long drink from my water bottle, trying to think clearly. I could keep pushing forward, but without a clear sense of direction, I might just be getting myself more lost. On the other hand, stopping and waiting for help didn't seem like much of an option either. No one knew exactly where I was. I hadn't told anyone about this specific trail, just that I'd be hiking in the general area. I needed a plan. First step, find shelter. I scanned the woods around me, looking for something, anything that could offer some protection. A cluster of rocks, a fallen tree, even a dense thicket. Something to get me off the ground and out of the wind. After a few minutes of searching, I found a shallow overhang at the base of a small hill. It wasn't much, but it would do. I cleared away some leaves and debris, creating a small space to sit. My backpack became my pillow, and I wrapped myself in my jacket, trying to conserve body heat. The woods grew darker by the second. The fading light turned everything gray and indistinct, and soon I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. The air grew colder, biting through my clothes. I could hear the forest coming alive around me. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl. I've always loved the sounds of the forest, but tonight they felt different. Every noise seemed closer, sharper. The rustling leaves sounded like footsteps, the snapping twigs like something moving through the trees. I told myself it was just animals, deer maybe, or raccoons. Nothing dangerous, nothing to worry about, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Hours passed. I'm not sure how many. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the darkness. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake, heart racing, every muscle tensed. A sound had woken me, a low, guttural noise, unlike anything I'd ever heard before, came from somewhere to my left, deep in the trees. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. A wet, choking noise, like something struggling to breathe. My mind raced. Could it be a wounded animal? A bear? No, bears don't make sounds like that. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know what most animals sound like. And this was something else. I slowly reached for my knife, my fingers closing around the handle. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The noise stopped. The woods went deathly silent. I waited, every nerve on edge. The silence stretched on, suffocating and absolute. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the leaves, coming closer and closer. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could hear it. Whatever it was walking upright. Not an animal, person. I tightened my grip on the knife, my knuckles turning white. My mouth went dry. I wanted to call out, to demand who they were and what they wanted, but fear kept my throat clenched shut. The footsteps stopped, just a few feet away. Silence. My pulse thundered in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed, an eternity. Then, slowly, The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance until they were gone. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, listening, waiting, but the woods remained silent. Finally, I allowed myself to breathe again, my whole body trembling with adrenaline. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn finally filtered through the trees, I got up and started moving. My legs felt like lead, every step an effort, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of those woods. It took hours, but eventually, I found the trail again. I don't know how. One moment I was stumbling through the undergrowth, and the next I was standing on a dirt path with a faded trail marker nailed to a tree. Relief flooded through me so hard I almost collapsed. I followed the trail back to the parking lot without looking back. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, like something was following me just out of sight. But when I finally broke through the trees and saw my car waiting for me, the feeling vanished. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, just breathing. I don't know what I heard out there. I don't know who or what was walking through the woods that night, and I don't want to know. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan to. I never should have gone that deep into the woods. Looking back now, it seems so obvious. All the signs were there. The unfamiliar terrain, the uneasy feeling in my chest, and that nagging voice in my head telling me to turn back. But I didn't listen. I pushed forward, and it nearly cost me everything. It all started on a quiet Saturday morning in late October. The air was crisp, and the sky was that kind of pale gray that promises rain but never delivers. I was itching to get out of the house, so I decided to head into the woods behind my uncle's cabin, a place I'd hiked plenty of times before. It wasn't unfamiliar territory. At least that's what I told myself. I packed light: a bottle of water, a protein bar, a small flashlight, and my phone, which barely had a signal out there. I wasn't planning to be gone long, maybe an hour or two, just enough to stretch my legs and clear my head. The first hour was peaceful. The forest was alive with the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The ground was soft beneath my boots, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying wood, a smell that I found oddly comforting. I stuck to the main trail at first, following its winding path through the trees. But after a while, I got bored. The main trail was too easy, too predictable. I wanted something more challenging, something off the beaten path. So when I saw a narrow, overgrown trail branching off to the left, I took it without a second thought. It was a mistake. The trail was rough and uneven, clearly not well traveled. Thorny bushes snagged at my clothes, and the ground was littered with fallen branches that threatened to trip me up. But I kept going, convinced that the trail would eventually loop back to the main path. Didn't. After about 30 minutes, the trail disappeared completely, swallowed up by the forest. I stopped and looked around, trying to get my bearings. The trees pressed in on me from all sides, their bare branches tangled together like skeletal fingers. I took out my phone and checked the GPS, but it was useless. The screen showed a blank map with a little blue dot in the middle of nowhere. No signal. Great, I muttered to myself. I wasn't worried yet. I figured I could just retrace my steps and find my way back to the main trail. So I turned around and started walking. 10 minutes later, I realized I was going the wrong way. The forest looked different, unfamiliar. The trees all looked the same, tall and bare, with gnarled trunks and twisted branches. The ground sloped gently downward, leading me deeper into the woods. Panic started to creep in. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I'd be fine if I just kept moving. I'd find the trail eventually, but I didn't. The farther I walked, the more lost I became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like claws. The air grew colder, and the sky darkened as thick clouds rolled in. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. My battery was at 23%. I kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was eerily quiet now. The only sound the crunch of leaves under my boots. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, just the forest settling. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. It was a feeling more than anything. A prickling at the back of my neck, an instinct I couldn't ignore. Someone or something was out there, watching me. I started walking faster, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I told myself not to run. Running would only make things worse. But my legs had a mind of their own. I broke into a jog, my breath coming in short gasps. The trees blurred around me, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. Then I heard it, a soft crunch behind me, barely audible over the sound of my own footsteps. I froze, my heart in my throat. I didn't dare turn around. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, straining to hear any other sound. But the forest was silent again. I forced myself to take a deep breath. Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the trees. Nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. I pressed on, my senses on high alert. The light was fading fast now, and I knew I needed to find shelter before nightfall. Wandering around in the dark would be a death sentence. After what felt like hours, I stumbled across a small clearing. In the center was an old, crumbling hunting cabin, its roof partially caved in and its windows shattered. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I pushed open the door, my flashlight casting a weak beam of light across the interior. The air inside was stale and musty, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. I sat down on an old, rotting chair, my legs trembling beneath me. I needed to rest, just for a minute, but that's when I saw it. Scratched into the wall, just above the door, were 3 words, "Leave before dark." My blood ran cold. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the room. The walls were covered in scratches, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all the same 3 words over and over again. My breathing quickened. I needed to get out of there now. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was away from that cabin. The woods were almost pitch black now, the trees looming like dark silhouettes against the sky. I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, my flashlight barely illuminating the ground in front of me. Then I heard it again, that soft crunch of leaves, closer this time. I broke into a full sprint, my breath ragged and my legs burning. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, I realized I was standing on the edge of a dirt road. Relief washed over me. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but at least I wasn't lost anymore. I followed the road, my legs heavy with exhaustion. After what felt like an eternity, I saw headlights in the distance. A truck pulled up beside me, the driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, rolling down his window. "You okay, son?" he asked. I nodded, too tired to speak. He gave me a concerned look but didn't press for details. "Hop in. I'll take you back to town." I climbed into the passenger seat, sinking into the worn leather. The warmth of the heater was a welcome relief. As we drove away, I glanced back at the dark line of trees, their twisted branches silhouetted against the night sky. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to know. But one thing's for sure, I'll never go back into those woods again. I always thought I knew the woods near my cabin. I've hiked them for years, every trail and hidden clearing. It's my escape, a place I go when life feels heavy. I never expected it would turn into something else, something that would leave me with memories I'll never shake, a story I'd rather not tell but can't stop thinking about. It started on a late October afternoon. The air was crisp, the kind that nips at your skin just enough to remind you winter isn't far. The leaves were a mix of deep reds and burnt oranges, covering the ground in a thick blanket that muffled every footstep. I planned a simple hike, nothing more than a loop through the woods behind my cabin. It's about 5 miles, an easy couple of hours before the sun sets. I grabbed my pack, filled with the usual: a bottle of water, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a snack. I've always been the prepared type, even for short hikes. My phone was fully charged, not that I expected to need it. Cell service out here is spotty at best, and I liked it that way. The quiet, the isolation, it's what drew me to the cabin in the first place. The trail started out familiar and comforting. The crunch of leaves under my boots, the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. I followed the path, winding through the dense trees, the late afternoon light filtering through the canopy in golden shafts. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was peaceful, normal. About an hour in, I noticed something strange. The trail, which I knew like the back of my hand, seemed off. It felt narrower, the trees closer together than I remembered. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. The woods change with the seasons, after all. Maybe the summer growth had shifted things around. Still, a little knot of unease settled in my gut. I pressed on, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. The woods grew darker, the shadows stretching longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. I glanced at my watch. For 30 p.m., plenty of time before dark. No reason to worry. Then I saw the clearing. It wasn't a clearing I recognized. A wide, open space surrounded by tall pines, the ground covered in moss instead of leaves. In the center stood a single dead tree, its bare branches reaching up like skeletal fingers. Something about it stopped me in my tracks. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to turn back. But the logical part of my brain told me it was fine. Maybe I just never stumbled across this spot before. The woods are big. It's possible. Still, that knot in my stomach tightened. I decided to take a different route back, cutting across the clearing and heading in what I thought was the direction of the main trail. It should have been simple. I had a good sense of direction. I've never gotten lost out here before, but the further I walked, the less familiar everything looked. The trees pressed in closer, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the fading light. The ground was uneven, tangled with roots and rocks that seemed determined to trip me up. I kept moving, my pace quickening, my breath coming faster. Then I saw it. A piece of blue fabric caught on a branch. Faded, torn, fluttering gently in the breeze. It looked like part of a shirt or jacket. I stopped, staring at it. Who else would be out here? I hadn't seen another person all day. My pulse quickened. I reached out and touched the fabric. It was damp, cold, recent. Someone had been here not long ago. I scanned the woods, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the trees and the shadows and the ever-deepening gloom. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe a hiker had passed through earlier and gotten snagged on the branch. No big deal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I pressed on, trying to stay calm. The woods grew darker with every step. I pulled out my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows. The trees seemed to close in even tighter, their gnarled trunks twisting into strange shapes in the dim light. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling just off to my right. I froze, straining to listen. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but it didn't sound right. The steps were too deliberate, too heavy. They stopped when I stopped, started when I started. Someone was following me. My heart hammered in my chest. I picked up my pace, trying to stay calm, to think rationally. Maybe it was another hiker, someone who had gotten turned around like I had. But why wouldn't they say something? I glanced over my shoulder, the flashlight beam sweeping through the trees. Nothing, just darkness and shadows. I kept moving, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The rustling continued, always just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the light. I tried to shake it off, to focus on finding the trail, but the panic was rising, clawing its way up my throat. Then I tripped. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and skidding across the ground. Pain shot through my ankle. I bit back a curse, scrambling to grab the flashlight. The beam flickered, then steadied. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh, pressed into the soft earth. They weren't mine. They were big, too big to be anything but human. And they were heading straight toward me. Panic surged. I pushed myself to my feet, ignoring the throbbing in my ankle. I limped forward, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. The rustling grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. The trees thinned, and I burst into another clearing. This one was smaller, surrounded by thick underbrush. I spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping wildly. No sign of anyone, just the woods, silent and still. I didn't stop. I pushed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The rustling faded, but I didn't slow down. Couldn't. Not until I found the trail. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto it. The familiar path, worn and well-trodden. Relief flooded through me. I turned and sprinted toward the cabin, ignoring the pain in my ankle, the burning in my lungs. I didn't stop until I reached the front porch, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath, trying to convince myself I was safe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whoever or whatever had been out there was still watching, waiting. I never found out who it was. I never went back to that part of the woods. Maybe it was just a hiker who got lost, someone as scared as I was. But deep down, I don't believe that. The woods aren't the same anymore. They're darker, quieter. The trails feel narrower, the trees closer. I still hike them sometimes, but I never go alone. And I never, ever stray from the path. Some places aren't meant to be explored.